Okay, so in this video, I will compare and contrast primary and secondary succession. It's really for my AP Bio class. It's my final video in community ecology, but if you're just watching this to learn about succession, it should work for you as well. So in general, ecological succession is basically like the changing or formation of an ecosystem. And we're going to look at primary succession first. And primary succession starts out on bare rock. So I took this picture in Volcanoes National Park in Hawaii last year. So here is some like an active volcano, right? So about I don't know how far, 10 minutes, 15-minute drive from this location. Here's the crater of a different volcano. And my family, we walked across it. So really, when we look at primary succession, it starts out like, how do we start with a brand new volcanic island and then eventually end up with biodiversity? Like, what are the changes that happen in the plant and animal communities in that region over the hundreds or thousands of years? So here's also a picture of Craters of the Moon National Monument in Idaho. Yeah, Idaho. And you can see like this is lava rock, but you can see that there's small amounts of plants beginning to grow on it. So in succession, we're going to start with a discussion of how do you start on bare rock and then end up with a whole forest of biodiversity. So, one last example is the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands are volcanic islands, and you can see from this aerial map the calderas, or like the peaks of the volcanoes that are now underwater. But the Galapagos are volcanic rock, and like here is a picture I took from like a cliff top when I was in the Galapagos in 2018, and you can see there's plants and life on these islands, enough to support wildlife. Here I am with one of the giant tortoises. And so let's go ahead and see how primary succession works. So we're going to start out on bare rock. So when an island just forms, one of the first organisms that arrives, not necessarily island, I was just talking about the Galapagos, but when there's bare rock exposed, whether it's from a volcano just forming a new island, or maybe it is like glaciers retreating. And when the glaciers retreat and melt, there's barren like rock below. Okay, so we start out on bare rock. And one of the first species to arrive is called a pioneer species. And lichens usually are that pioneer species. Now, lichens are made of a fungus and an algae, and they live together in a mutualistic relationship. So they are the only things that can live on bare rock. Now, the fungus part of this lichen will actually secrete an acid that begins to slowly erode the rock layers. Now, lichens come in many different colors and forms. Here's a picture I took in Sunset Crater in Arizona. This volcano erupted about 1100 AD, so about 900 years ago, and you can see there are plants beginning to form and grow here. So this area is in the process of primary succession, but this is a picture in that same region that I took of lichens growing on lava rock. Now, lichens grow on rocks even if it's not lava. Like here's a picture of lichens I took in, I believe it was in Colorado on a hiking trip. And then here is me and some lichens, some orange lichens growing in some rocks in Yosemite. So lichens are the first species to arrive, and the cool thing about them is that as they die, decompose, as they wear away the rock layers, now this can take a long time. Eventually, though, there's going to be a fine layer of soil. And that fine layer of soil can support moss or grasses or weeds. So you're going to have your small plants begin to grow. Now they're going to grow, they're going to die, they're going to decompose. And then the soil layers get thicker and thicker, where eventually over time, these grasses will be replaced with shrubs and small plants. Now, it's not just that the shrubs and small plants magically show up out of nowhere. It could be that seeds were carried in the wind, or birds migrating or flying overhead pooped and seeds fell. But one way or another, seeds begin to germinate, and they are for larger like type plants. Now, It's important to also keep in mind that as plants compete with each other for space, once the soil is deep enough and roots of these shrubs can take hold and they grow taller than the grasses, they're going to outcompete the grass and the small plants for like sunlight, right? They'll put shade onto the grass and the grass will die. It's also important to keep in mind that as you transition from like a grass community to a shrub or bushes community, the animals that can be supported will also change. You can imagine how now with shrubs you might find more snakes or birds or mice or rodents, right? So more life can be supported here. And then eventually, though, again, with passing birds or wind or animals going by and pooping, you're going to have these shrubs be replaced with like immature trees. Now, these trees may not grow very large, maybe like smaller type tree species that will eventually be replaced by like long-lived tree species like oak trees or hickory or something like that. Now these like larger tree species are going to form what we call a climax community. Now climax community is like a stable community in an ecosystem or an area, or it is like the final stage of succession. So I want you to think back from the lichens to the grasses to the shrubs to the smaller immature trees to now this final community. And think about the animals that can be supported by the varying types of primary producers. As you reach this climax community, it can be a home or a habitat for a wide variety of organisms. So you could have more birds, maybe some primates or some sloths, some mammals, some deer, some predators, right? Lots of different types of interactions between different species can all exist here in this climax community. So as you transition from lichens to grasses all the way through your climax community, the animal species will also be changing over time. Now, in primary succession, to get from bare rock to a forest, that's going to take maybe thousands of years. And so if you think back to that picture of the volcano active on Hawaii, to all the biodiversity on Hawaii, that is a long process of succession. Now, sometimes, so here's a kind of a graph showing like the different ecological stages and how the biodiversity increases over time. Now, sometimes, though, unfortunately, disturbances can happen where maybe there's a forest fire that destroys a community, right? And so now we're left with bare trees. The trees are gone, or bare trunks. I don't know. Like life has been cleared, but the soil remains. So in secondary succession, it's going to repeat the same process of starting out with small plants that are fast growing. These are actually going to be like our selected species. They'll be replaced with shrubs and smaller trees, and then those trees will be replaced with your larger trees, eventually reaching your climax community. So in secondary succession, it follows a lot of the same stages as primary succession, but the difference is that we already have soil in place, and so it can kind of happen much faster. And so, that wasn't smooth, sorry. When we compare and contrast primary and secondary succession, we find that they both are the process of species and habitat changing over time in an area, eventually reaching a climax community. But the differences are that in primary succession, it starts out on bare rock and will require a pioneer species such as lichens, and primary succession can take hundreds or thousands of years, whereas secondary succession occurs after some kind of ecological disturbance, such as a forest fire. But it could also be as simple as a human like clearing a forest and allowing like agriculture or farmland to take place, and then abandoning the property and then watching, like, first it'll start with weeds and it'll get all overgrown. But if you leave it long enough, it may restore to a forest similar to what it was before it was cleared for agriculture. We can also see secondary succession in like rainforests, where sometimes like conservation groups can buy a previously cleared region of the rainforest and then allow it to regrow, and that would be secondary succession. All right, great job.